tend to, oh, that's okay. So I look forward to the questions and discussion, and grateful for everybody that's taking part. Miigwech.
Miigwech Vera. Next up, we have Stefan.
What's up? Hello, good morning. Hope everybody's okay. My name is Stefan Richard. My name is Red Thunderbird Flying, and my family comes from the Saugeen First Nation, and I'm here on behalf of the, I guess you could say, radio side of media. I work on Now Country 104.7. I'm the morning show host. You might hear me in the morning. You might listen to country music. If you don't listen to country music, I don't blame you. But at the same time, I'm here with open eyes and open ears, and I'm hoping that I can maybe share some experience and maybe learn a lot as well. So thanks for having me.
Yeah, Miigwech. And last and certainly not least, Nigan, please go.
Great. So bonjour, everybody. Bonjour, Ndeme Magraduk, Nigan Wavedam Indigenous Cost, Namago Shindo Dem, Nimen Wendam Omayayan. It's a pleasure to be here. And I'm a columnist with the Winnipeg Free Press. Of course, I'm a associate professor at the University of Manitoba. Happy not to be on strike. Yeah, just happy to be here. I'm sort of madly working around because I required my students to be here today. So where is this being live streamed, just so that I know?
It's live. It's actually being streamed live on my Facebook account.
Your Facebook account. Okay. All right.
Yeah, so it's under my Facebook account. So we are actually using UMFM 101.5, which is our campus radio station at the University of Manitoba. It is their account. I thought that it would be live streamed to their account, but it turns out it's being streamed to my Facebook account. Okay, so if they want to just go find me, like I have an open Facebook, so they can just go check it out.
All right, great. I will send that link to them. Yep. So it's really nice to be here. Nice to be with people that I know of their work, or I know of them personally, and deeply respect all of our work in the media in different ways. What I would say is that I never planned on being in the media. And by the way, I'm just getting over COVID, so I've still got this cough. So, yeah, I just kind of fell into the media, and I don't consider myself a reporter in any way. I just consider myself I got opinions. That's basically, there it is. I don't consider them qualified, really, opinions all the time, but I'm in the media. Here I am. So, okay, nice to see everybody.
Miigwech Kose to all of you for your beautiful introduction. So we're going to get started. We'll jump right in. I think one of the best ways to start, since we are discussing decolonizing the media, as we know, a lot of Indigenous peoples, BIPOC communities as well, sometimes we kind of get misrepresented in the media. So before we begin, I would kind of like to ask all four of you, we'll begin in the same, I'll go in the same order that I asked for your introductions, just because that's how you're all looking on my screen. But let's begin with what does the term decolonize mean to you? And we'll go Leonard, Vera, Stefan, Nigan.
I think just from my perspective, like I had to think about it a little bit, but for me, it's undoing a lot of what we've been taught, a lot of what we've learned through education systems, through media, through all of these different things that we've grown up with. It's undoing what those things are and kind of relearning some of that traditional knowledge, going back to the ceremonies, going back to traditional customs, and reintegrating that knowledge system into our everyday lives. So that's kind of the way that I've always taken it, is kind of unlearning and then re-implementing those traditional values.
Sorry, I got to keep unmuting. For me, decolonizing, I think it really is important for everybody to understand who we are as Indigenous people, accepting and working and living with us in unity, and not just the separation that keeps happening. We still see it today. You know, decolonization is crucial in bringing back our languages, our traditions, our cultures, and knowing who we are and sharing who we are proudly, and not being ashamed anymore and denying who we are. I went through a period. I've been in the media 30 years. When I first was a journalist, I did not state who I was. I hid it because of the stigma, of the way people reacted to me as an Indigenous woman. Back 30 years ago, there were not a lot of people of our color on air. So I think the most crucial part is sharing who we are, but accepting who we are. I'll leave it at that in further conversation.
All right, well, before we start, if you do hear something that sounds like a phone ringing, my apartment complex is testing fire alarms today. So that's what's going on in the background. I apologize if it's annoying. Decolonizing, I think I had a conversation with somebody. I have a friend who's from Zimbabwe, and his theory on decolonization was, his experience, I should say, with decolonization was having colonizers come to his country, extract a million different resources, extract people, and then they left. Except in Canada, it didn't exactly work that way. Obviously, we still have people who are here, they're extracting our resources, they're extracting our people, and it's gotten out of hand. But so we have a very different situation here in which we have to, in a sense, live with the colonizers and the people who are trying to oppress our voices or change our voices or twist our voices. And you're going to hear me say it a lot today, is that we need to tell our own stories. And I think the best example I can give, I use a lot of humor and I use a lot of comparisons. So if I'm trying to be funny, I'm not trying to be disrespectful. It's just the way that my brain works. But it's like if I had something to write about, like Wayne Gretzky, I wouldn't ask a football reporter to tell me about it. So that's the kind of a mindset that I'm coming into this with, is that the idea of us being media people and being First Nations, Métis, Inuit people across the country, we have to tell our own stories. And I think that's as far as the media side, that we're going to, the closest we're going to get to decolonization immediately. Of course, there's lots to come after that, but I feel like the safest bet is to tell our own stories and use our own voices.
Okay, so I mean, there's often a blurred line between decolonization and indigenization. So I think what we're doing is we're often talking about both here, but decolonization is basically for indigenous and non-indigenous peoples, removing the systems around us which have imprisoned our bodies, but also imprisoned our minds, and the ways in which we've been taught to think a certain way, act a certain way, perceive, and then therefore raise our children in certain ways. So as media, we have a tremendous amount of control in order to deconstruct that system. We are surrounded by a very heteronormative world, a very Christian world, a very British-centered world, a European, Eurocentric world. And so our job to decolonize is to begin to dismantle those systems. And it's not just indigenous peoples, it should be non-indigenous peoples, but indigenous peoples, of course, it's paramount importance to us. And we also are perhaps best positioned to help our non-indigenous brothers and sisters to dismantle the systems that imprison their bodies and minds as well. Because colonization is something that hurts all of us. It creates the extractive industries around us. It creates a kind of sense of a mono identity that all people should be acting the same. It also creates this horrible legacy, which we can see in the outcomes that create things like COVID or create things like Donald Trumps of the world and so on. And so we have these decolonizing is removing all of those systems around us. But then, of course, indigenization is something that has also been talked about by my panelists as well, which is how do we bring our languages and our cultures and our ways into these different mediums which have never had them before. Every single indigenous person who is part of a newsroom or a radio show or a newspaper column, like you're changing the business by simply your presence, by just being there. And that doesn't mean that, if you're you have to be a fluent language speaker or attend ceremonies, you just by the mere sake that we are in industries that have never allowed us or has been discouraging us. There's a really great book by Carmen Robertson called Seeing Red, and it's about Indigenous representation in newspapers for 150 years. And from the very first moment of newspapers, all the different media that existed, in one of the oldest forms of media in the country, it was hell-bent part of the colonial project to demonize us, to remove us from lands, to say that our parenting was inappropriate and create residential schools. So media has been hand in hand, one of the most violent systems of the country. So when we're part of these industries, we both decolonize it and begin the process of indigenization.
Miigwech for all of your answers. Thank you so much. So our next question is, in your experience, you all have some years under your belt working within the media, whether that be television, radio, print, whatever it may be. In your experience, how has the media portrayed Indigenous, even BIPOC peoples, including yourselves? Have you ever faced negative or positiveness, or like what have you seen in your experience? So well, again, we'll start with Leonard. It's just easier to keep that flow going.
I grew up in Winnipeg's North End. I grew up reading the Winnipeg Sun. I watched the 6 o'clock news. I watched the 10 o'clock news. I watched 10:30, 11 o'clock news as well when I was a kid. So I've always grown up watching and reading the news for forever, basically. And a lot of the negative perceptions that we've had, and a lot of the I was thinking about a particular columnist who has kind of had like a change in the public perception over the last few years. And this one particular person has always been like a fire starter, getting all of these First Nations issues and putting them out. We don't pay taxes. We're, just a bunch of really negative stereotypes about who we are. And, I was thinking about how much of an impact that's had on, a city or a community like Winnipeg, when you've got, traditional print media that has shaped the stereotypes of who we are in over a long period of time, right? And how much of an impact that's had. And so, you think about places like the Winnipeg Sun, like how long have I stopped reading the Winnipeg Sun? Probably about at least 10 years ago now, just because I wasn't aware of it when I was younger, how much of, those front page tabloid ads are of us being, the gangsters, and, the Winnipeg's most wanted top 10 is something that played heavy in those front pages all the time. And so those kind of things have always, shaped who we are. And it goes back to kind of what Nigan was saying about seeing red, is that, you kind of need that to justify, the land theft and everything else that's happening. And to me, it's crazy watching, like, the child welfare deal that came out yesterday, $40 billion deal that was announced. Like, it's just, everything is just really an ongoing continuation of, what the start of this country has been. And it still continues, right? And even though there's a $40 billion deal, a lot of the stuff that we're seeing will continue. Like, that's not going to change anytime soon. So it's this kind of stuff that I've been thinking about.
Miigwech, Leonard. The question, I gave a lot of thought to the question, because as you know, I said I've been in the industry for 30 years, born and raised in my home community. I spoke Ojibwe first and foremost. I'm a survivor of residential school. When I came to the city, the very first job I ever applied for wasn't in the media. I never intended to be in the media. My intention, was to be a social worker, and I did do social work. But the very first job I applied for, I had to come on the transit of the Greyhound bus from the reserve to the city. Went for my interview, and the lady, I filled out the application, and of course my home address at the time was Sandy Bay. And she asked me where that was and how I would go back and forth. And I said, it's the reserve that's on Lake Manitoba. And I would move to the city, so I'd be available for work every day. Went through the whole process, and at the end, she says, I'm really sorry. She says, but you're not competent because of your drinking. Drinking, you're not competent. And I was like, oh, okay. And I left. got on the bus, I went back home. My grandpa picked me up on the road and he goes, so did you get the job? Are you moving? And I'm like, no, I didn't get the job because I can't drink in the library. And he looked at me and he goes, what? I said, I can't drink in the library because this job I applied for was in the library. It was an entry for me to get into the city. And he goes, what do you mean? And he literally stopped the truck and he goes, what do you mean you can't drink in the library? I said, well, if I'm going to work around the books, I can't drink. I can't drink anything. And he goes, why do you say that? I said, because she told me I'm not competent because of my drinking. I was 17. I just graduated and lived on the reserve my entire life. So I didn't know what this non-Indigenous woman was saying to me or understand it. And that was my first experience as an Indigenous woman coming to the city to get a job, and it never changed. After that, the next job I applied for, I did not state who I was. And I maintained, they said, oh, you're Portuguese? Yeah, okay. I had a great job, worked for 4 years, went to school. I became a journalist in the late 80s, and it was the first ever program called the Aboriginal Journalism Program. They wanted to have more Indigenous people in the mainstream media. There was 18 of us, 11 graduated, and a small handful of us went into the mainstream media. I went to CTV. It was a private broadcaster at the time. It wasn't owned by Bell Media as it is today. Back then, Randy Moffat was the owner of Bell CKY TV, not CTV. So I was there for many years, and I loved what I did. I was the first Indigenous woman in Manitoba to be in the private industry. We had people at CBC, which was government, but at CTV, it was the first time they had an Indigenous woman. And I was really proud of it. And it was challenging because there were some people that believed I was there as a special employee, that I didn't get paid by Moffat Industries, to the point that I had to show my pay stub and said, no, here's, Moffat Industries, it's not from Indian Affairs. It took a while, a few years to change. And then APTN came along. And I can't even express how incredibly exhilarating and powerful that was. And I've been there as of yesterday for 17 years now, telling our stories our way. I don't know if I went off topic, but just wanted to share that kind of is where I started. And, today I've never, ever denied. After I started working at CKY, I had no shame, or I stopped being ashamed. I started owning and stopped living two lives, because I did live two lives. I lived one life where I went home for ceremonies and maintained my language. And then my other life was living in the city, not, being true to who I was as an Indigenous woman. That stopped in the early 90s, I have to say. I'll leave it at that.
I'm just going to briefly cut in before our next speaker goes, but you didn't go off topic at all. I think it's important that we share those personal stories to know the things that do go on behind the scenes, behind the cameras, behind the mic, all that type of stuff, right? Like so many non-Indigenous broadcasters of any type of media field, they don't experience it, or some of them may not even believe that these things are real. So one of the main purposes of this webinar was to hear these types of stories and to elaborate and figure out ways on moving forward. So miigwech for sharing, and sorry to interject. So
that's fine. I have many stories to share, but I'll space them out.
Okay, Stefan, go ahead.
Okay, so when I started in the media, I did not intend to start in the media. I was actually a professional wrestler for a lot of years, and I did a lot of things around Canada, around the US, went international for a little while. And then I had, there's a documentary about it. I'll get to it in a second, but I had a lot of substance abuse issues. And eventually, once I got clean, there was a documentary done, a series of documentaries called Sobering Stories, in which it was just a group of people that wanted to tell their story of getting sober. And that's what I did. And I did it with a group from Chicago. It was a couple guys who were just looking to get into film and document these things that they felt so personal about. But the way that they handled it was very respectful. They were Jewish guys. So as we know, like, Jewish history is is very similar to some of the things that we've experienced. Like there's attempted genocide, there was residential schools, Holocaust, there's a lot of comparative things. So these people took very good care of my story. But when I came back here and I started speaking here, I immediately realized that when it was somebody that wasn't careful with my story or understanding of my story, my trauma became very sexualized in a sense. And I use that term very, obviously not sexualized, but it became like poverty porn. People trying to just get off and hear my story, and almost as if I was entertainment. And I realized that I was contributing to my own damaged narrative, and I didn't much care for it. And I eventually got into podcasting just for something fun to do. And then podcasting grew, and I eventually got a job offer from APTN, and I did a podcast for APTN for a while. And then I moved into radio, and now I've been in radio for a few years. But most of the stories that I have encountered with my own personal experience done by somebody else that is not understanding of the trauma or the history of the people in this country, well, my trauma or our trauma was very entertaining in a sense. And I realized that once it crossed that line from being educational or beneficial to someone to just a very sexy thing to talk about, I realized that our stories, specifically my story, needed something else. It doesn't need to be grasped onto and turned into like a hot topic issue, when addiction and mental health is a hot topic issue and needs to be addressed, but not in a sense where people are getting off on it. And I realized that a few years into like speaking and sharing my story, that there was people who just came for like entertainment, and I didn't like that. So now when I'm in radio and I need to share stories and I need to share things that are happening in the indigenous community, I take the time to go through it and address it in the most respectful way that I can, even if it has nothing to do with me or has nothing to do with any of my interests. I need to be conscious because, like, on the Winnipeg scene, I'm the only First Nation morning radio host, beside NCI, which is a targeted indigenous station. Like all the other stations, I'm the only First Nations morning person. So if somebody listens to me, I have to offer them something different, which is a well thought out story in a minute and a half, which is usually what like a radio break would be. So I have to be very conscious of that. But I realized that all of this was coming from a damaged narrative, and I didn't much care for it. So my experience so far with decolonization, with how the media has portrayed it, again, I mentioned it off the top, I'll mention it now. We need to tell our own stories. Again, if a hockey player is doing great, you don't ask a football reporter to report on it. It's just that simple.
My first kind of career was a high school teacher. And so I worked a lot with teaching students to just be critical of the media. And, part of that was just growing up. When I was growing up in the 80s and 90s, there was, as Leonard pointed out, there was this top 10 most wanted, and they were always exclusively Indigenous. And this is what I saw every single morning growing up. So the media has spent all of its time demonizing and creating these horrible stereotypes for the purposes of influencing public opinion to support public policy. And yes, there's, we could say things like newspapers are independent, but newspapers are really just products of society. And so if society's views are racist, then therefore the media, because the media is radio, TV, newspapers, whatever, they're feeding into, they have to get clicks, or they have to get advertising, or they have to get readership. So therefore they're giving people what they're interested in. And what were they interested in? They're interested in really hating Indigenous peoples. And so the media is all part of a system that therefore feeds that for a very long period of time. And it only began to shift for me. I think that, we have to give kudos to incredible people like Vera, who've been in this for a long period of time, Richard Wagamis, Doug Cuthand, all of these amazing people. Rosanna Deerchild here in Winnipeg has been in the media for forever. And so just incredible people who have been doing such a long time, Trevor Grey Eyes as well. Anyways, so We can talk about that, but for me, I only fell into the media during Idle No More. And Idle No More, there was a group of about 10 of us that organized most of the Idle No More events. People like Jerry Daniels, Leah Gazan, Michael Champagne, myself, Michael Cannon, a number of other people as well that were part of that group. And so what ended up happening is I ended up doing a lot of media during that time, because frankly, the media was so interested far more in a monkey in IKEA than the fact that hundreds of thousands of people were marching in the streets talking about peace and changing the relationship and stop stealing Indigenous lands. So we began to try to change that narrative. And so I was on the radio shows and newspapers, and I was in almost every single church in the city talking to every single congregation, because we were trying to get that story out of what Idle No More was about, which is about a peace-loving, generative movement led by Indigenous young people. And so that ended up being giving me a very stark view of the racism, but then also a really interesting thing about the media. The media likes to portray itself as this objective, or we got to tell all these different stories, right? Or we got to tell the other side, right? So what's the other side of Indigenous people's arguments? Like, what is our main arguments? We should be treated like human beings. We should not have our land stolen. We should have a society that lives up to this wonderful thing, or this wonderful vision of treaties, which is to create family and people living together and learning from one another. So what's the other side of that? Racism. Indigenous peoples aren't human beings. We should steal Indigenous lands. And then most important is that we should hate Indigenous peoples and treat them like second-class citizens, so that we hammer them into the child welfare system or the jails, or put them into addiction. So what I learned from the media was that every single time I was on a radio show, they're like, well, we got to get the other side. And then boom, I was on the other side with like Ezra Levant, or Francis Widdowson, or Tom Flanagan. So what I realized is that the media is completely incapable of having a competent conversation on Indigenous issues, because they thought that the other side, which is just racism, is somehow a legitimate form of argument, which isn't the case at all. There are people, of course, Indigenous peoples, who argue for pipelines, who argue that the Indian Act's a good thing, that, there's a whole bunch of different things that Indigenous peoples, and that's an interesting dialogue, but that was never taking place until very recently. So the way that I fell into the media is I realized that there needs to be systemic change, training, knowledge within reporters, editors, the people who own the newspaper, that of what it takes to be an Indigenous person, or what is our experiences as Indigenous peoples. And then most importantly, that non-Indigenous peoples need to understand that they have been created by relationships with Indigenous peoples, and in every single way, in every single law, every part of our language, every part of our laws comes from Indigenous peoples. And so the sooner that we can get to a point where we just have competency, this basic understanding of who we are and what does that mean to share a society together, the media is going to be a key part of that, which is why I chose to become a part of the Free Press Newsroom back in 2017, because I knew that it wasn't just about writing a column here, or writing a little piece over here, or appearing in a news story at CBC, or being on Power and Politics. So my two main venues now are being a columnist with the Winnipeg Free Press and being on Power and Politics every Friday on the news show. And so those are two, I think, really important venues that I think I can contribute to try to change media overall within the country, to stop putting forth this racist narrative of what Indigenous peoples are, and hearing from Indigenous peoples themselves. And as you can hear from my other fellow panelists, I mean, really diverse experiences, and we don't always agree, and that's the whole point.
Miigwech Kose. I just kind of wanted to add on to what you guys have been saying, like Steph and I've been in and out of radio for about 10 years. I used to work at NCI numerous times. Before it was Now Country, it was once Streets 104.7, then Rhythm 104.7, which I was a part of both of those, doing the afternoon drive shows. And one of the reasons why those radio stations had been changed is because there was that negative portrayal of Indigenous gang rap and North End, that type of way of looking at the radio station back in the day. So, and that wasn't even that long ago. So it flabbergasts me to see that this is still going on in 2022, right? So, but thank you all for sharing that. Since we're kind of on this topic, maybe we can move move where we're going here and think of the ways that we can improve the way that Indigenous peoples are portrayed within the media, and how the media persuades their viewers to view Indigenous peoples. So in your opinion, in your thoughts, what are some ways that we can improve the issues, the topics, the representation, and the stories within the media that are being shared by Indigenous as well as non-Indigenous broadcasters alike?
I'm going first again.
Yeah, you're gonna go first again.
Well, I think it goes back to what Stefan was saying, like we need Indigenous people to tell their own stories, and it's good to have like, you know, a wide range of places to tell those stories, whether that's FM, Country Now, APTN, CBC, Winnipeg Free Press. There's so many different ways to get messages across, and I think that social media has been like the biggest game changer for Indigenous peoples. You think about social media and technology and how, you know, we've been able to incorporate that technology and translate it into jobs, but also translate it into getting our issues, our stories, our messages across. I feel like I got hired through the media. I never ever actually thought that I was going to get a job within the media. I've got a criminal record. I've got like nothing on my resume during my 20 to 30 years old that says that I'm a competent person. But it was through social media and writing on things like Facebook, like, oh, this guy can write, right? Like this guy has opinions on things. And so in a lot of ways, you know, Indigenous peoples have, you know, transferred all of their knowledge onto social media, and have been able to push their messaging in a way that, you know, mainstream media has finally caught on to it, right? And in my opinion, you know, things like Idle No More were probably the game changer for us, where, you know, we're connected in real time and we're sharing our perspectives. And so much has changed over the last, you know, 8, 9, 10 years when it comes to Indigenous representation in things like mainstream media. But again, it goes back to, you know, I'm a digital journalist working with the CBC's Indigenous unit and trying to figure out ways like, you know, how do we get our stories onto TikTok? How do we get our stories onto Instagram? How do we do different stories on Twitter? How do we do stories different on Facebook? And what is the next trend, right? Like you always have to kind of figure out how are we going to get our message across. And, you know, like it's a thing with CBC, like they're on GEM, they're on Roku TV, they're on YouTube, they're on all of these different apps, and trying to figure out how do you remain relevant. And so that's a question that a lot of people have is, you know, where are you going to get those messages across? And for anybody that is, you know, in a position to tell their stories on a platform, you know, whether that be TikTok, whether that be CBC, APTN, I tell new journalists all the time, like when I started at the CBC, I took the approach that if I've got one story to tell, what is it going to be? And if I'm going to be there for a while, I'm going to try to put on as many different people and as many different voices as possible. And if I'm going to be on the radio, I'm going to try to bring as many people that I know onto the radio as possible, so that you're introducing all of these different perspectives, so that it doesn't look like, you know, we don't all think like Negon Sinclair. And that's not a shot at Negon Sinclair, but it's just to show that there's a wide range and diversity of opinions when it comes to, you know, pipelines, when it comes to ceremonies, when it comes to all of these other different things. Like there's so many different ways to think about things. And that's, I think, one of the biggest things that Canadians need to know right now is that there's not a monolith of ideas that exist, especially in places like Winnipeg. Like we've got such a large Indigenous population. We've got a very active community, a very bright community, but also a community that struggles. And so it's important to highlight all of these different perspectives. So.
Sorry, I was deep in thought, thinking about what is the question again? How do we move forward? Sorry.
No, it's okay. How do we, as Indigenous broadcasters or people in the media, what type of actions or narrative can we take to change the views that people have towards Indigenous peoples that are portrayed through these media outlets?
Okay, sorry. I was just thinking quite heavily on Leonard. I was, how do we do that? You know, in the mainstream media, yes, we have a responsibility, but as Indigenous people we also have a responsibility to remain humble, but remain true to ourselves. I do a lot of speaking, or I did prior to COVID. I'd go to the schools, I'd go to our communities. I don't work in the industry of news to say anymore. I used to be a news director at APTN. I now work in community relations. My responsibilities there are different, where I go into the communities to work with and talk to youth, to community members, to leaders, to find out where we at APTN can help bridge a gap to bring everybody together, to work together, you know, so that what we're doing at APTN is reflective of the communities that we are reaching, but also the non-Indigenous communities. We want everybody to hear our stories, and that's right across the country. But I feel that, as I'm a mother of 4 daughters and I have 12 grandchildren, and I think it is so crucial that they remain grounded and aware of who they are and being proud of who they are and sharing that. Because I think as our youth and our young people are confident about who they are, that story keeps moving forward through the classes, through the high schools, through everyday life. We have to be responsible for that more than just within the media. Like, we as journalists have that responsibility, but I think at home we have to remember we continue that and we move that forward. One of my students from many, many years ago actually had come to CKY and mentored and followed me around for a couple of weeks. And today she's still in the industry. And she had come to the school, or I had gone to her school to talk about being an Indigenous woman in the mainstream media. And I challenged the 23 students in that classroom to go home and learn about their identity and share it with 5 people. And I went back in a month to find out what did it mean to them. And they wound up learning so much about their own identity and who they were as people that it became very proud. They became very proud to share who they are. So that's kind of what I take back to our communities. Learn about who you are, your identity, and share it and keep moving that forward, because that wheel is eventually going to make changes that is going to have impact, and it's going to reach the media. Because you know, when things happen in a community, who hears about it? When you hear these little things that are, you know, going on, all of a sudden the media picks up. It's like, oh, how did that start? And our people start telling their stories and they become shared on Instagram, on TikTok. The short stories become bigger stories. How many times have we seen those little stories become full-fledged stories within the media? You know, so I think taking on that onus and responsibility, being proud of who you are and sharing it, moving it forward, is one sure way to move it positively. Sorry. Big Rich.
I agree with everything that's been said so far. It sounds great. I really like the takes that Leonard and Vera both had. One thing that I found was really helpful to me as a young person is somebody from our community giving us power, giving us something to grasp onto as children. When I was young, I remember there was a boxer from Winnipeg. Some of you might know him. He's still around. His name is Arthur Cook. He's from Peguis. He's a few years older than me, but at the time when I was like 12, 13 years old, he was the world heavyweight boxing champion for under 23. And I'm talking about like world champion, not just like champion of Peguis. He's like the world champion. And when I saw that and I understood, there's a guy from Manitoba who is achieving things and grabbing onto things out there in the world that seem absolutely unattainable to me. However, he's gone from living in Peguis to becoming a world champion. There's not a lot of like media on him at the time. And I'm assuming that probably had to do with the state of media, 20 years ago. But at the same time, I think we have to give power to the young people to hear our voice so that their voice can come through. I have 2 young children, and I want them to know that when they go into the world, things will be okay for them. My partner is African-American. She's from California. Her father grew up in the 60s in Los Angeles at the time of the Black Panthers, the civil rights movement. So there's a lot of similarities and common threads between my family's history and her family's history. There's a lot of reclamation that's going on. There's, if you watch the African-American community, they've come so far since the 60s, since that civil rights movement. And I feel like we're on the same path. It may be a different path, but I feel like we're growing and the ball is rolling to which we can tell our own stories. Because when I was a kid and I would go to, my grandma lived right behind Nietzsche Foods on Dufford and Robinson. And I would walk over every morning and get my grandma a raisin bannock. And I would also grab the grassroots news because I knew that I would hear things from my community, from people that I knew and people that I understood what they were saying. And I feel like, in a sense, to have people listen to us, we need to be better at what we do than what they do. And what I'm saying is that we need to present Indigenous stories in such a way that it has to be different to the point where it has to grab a non-Indigenous person's attention. Because if we're just as good as them, nobody's going to care. We have to go above. And that's what a lot of things rely on, is us going above and beyond. And I'm really hoping that things like this keep happening, like panels, students, academics, journalists, people from the community can hear our voices and understand that, these things are attainable. Like when I watched Arthur Cook fight, in 2001 at the Duckworth Center. Like, I don't think I would be here right now if I didn't watch that, because I saw the world heavyweight champion from Peguis at the time go in and main event a sold out Duckworth Center. It blew my mind. It was the first time I'd ever seen anything like that. And it's like, obviously I'm bringing it up now 20 years later, so it still has an effect. But had I not seen something like that, like a guy like Arthur Cook, I don't think I would be here. I would probably be just working a 9 to 5, just bringing home a paycheck every 2 weeks. And that's not what I'm about. I'm about growing and listening to the young people's voices, just like somebody listened to us, like somebody listened to Leonard, somebody listened to Vera, somebody listened to Nigon, somebody listened to you, Taylor. So for somebody to just listen and just give that little opportunity, I feel like that can make all the difference in the world.
I love that story, Stefan. You kept making me think about how the fact that I don't think people would have heard as much about Reggie Leach if not for someone like yourself doing a podcast with him, someone like like John Sampson doing podcasts, like Reggie Leach is, of course, we all know an Indigenous hockey player, should be in the Hall of Fame. I bet if he wasn't Indigenous, he'd probably be in the Hall of Fame. And so the whole idea that our legacy and our heroes oftentimes aren't recognized by the mainstream, but recognized by our community, I think is one of the keys to think about that. I mean, my first gig was with a newspaper in the North End of Winnipeg called Urban Indian, owned by Colleen Simard, and it only lasted about a year and a bit, and maybe almost 2 years. And but I mean, it was a venue for me to work with other Indigenous reporters, to be in an Indigenous centered newsroom, and to work for an Indigenous editor. I mean, which just was a groundbreaking moment for me. And that led me to this, to see what the media is capable of. Now, when I started at the Winnipeg Free Press, I can tell you that it was only about 4 or 5 years ago when I started, and there's really some profound racist views that were just considered the norm there, like really basic base positions that people had within the editorial board, particularly, that were just really problematic positions in terms of just misunderstanding or ignorance, or we could just call it racism, in terms of not racism in terms of the vindictive kind, but in terms of the kind of implicit ignorant side, where people just didn't understand basic principles, like what is the Indian Act, or what is intergenerational legacies, or what is the TRC. Like there was some basic lack of knowledge amongst the newsroom. So when I brought the conversations forward, it certainly didn't change overnight, but now we put out, we were one of the only newspapers in the country to call for the resignation of a premier over his racist and factually incorrect views. And then that led, I'm not saying it was the only thing, but it was one of the many things that led to, do we all realize that Manitoba did the very first thing in Canadian history, which was remove a Canadian political leader for racist views? Brian Pallister didn't lose his job because he closed ERs or mishandled the pandemic. He lost his job because his party turned against him due to his racist and factually incorrect and divisive views. Like, that's remarkable. And I think the media was a big part of that, because it was the bringing those facts to everyday Canadians, what we all know, which is that settlers didn't come to this country well-meaning. They came to it for the purposes of taking and extracting. So as anyways, so I think that, what we're doing in the newsrooms, or what we're doing in journalism, or what we're doing on, in my case, political talk shows, is bringing points of view that are really critically important. But I think one of the interesting things that I've really experienced is when I'm on CBC Power and Politics, I have to talk about everything. I have to talk about Doug Ford, what color tie he was wearing in this press conference, right? Like, I have to talk about that as much as I have to talk about Wet'suwet'en and the issue of lobster fishing out in for the Mi'kmaq in Nova Scotia. So it's amazing to me how many editors will say, Egon, one of the best things that you do is you don't talk about Indigenous issues. It's like a weird position that we are in the media, like as if we're still just being thought of as human beings for the very first time. And yes, we do have opinions on everything, and yes, we do have experiences in boxing and wrestling and hockey and whatever else that we're human beings. And so I think in many ways, to be a human being as an Indigenous person is still a revolutionary act. It still blows people's minds that we are human beings, and that we have this kind of complexity and diversity, and we're not a monolith, right? That we're not just people who are what I think the mainstream thinks, which is basically a powwow dancer or a ceremonial person. And we are, of course, those things and more. And to be an Indigenous person, to wear that proudly, but then also wear your humanness out there, I think is a revolutionary act. And I think the mainstream is that's how we change the mainstream's perception of Indigenous peoples, is that we bring out, like, one of the greatest things I think I've experienced is and I give him kudos all the time, but watching Leonard's career has just been a remarkable thing for me, because he has an experience that I've never had. He also has a knowledge in the way that he's got into the industry, and he's changed the industry at CBC. Like, I can tell you that, Leonard, your presence at the CBC, amongst others as well, Jillian and Kim and others, the other people as well. But I would say your presence, because I think it's been one of the longest alongside Tim, just remarkable game changing of that newsroom, right, over in CBC. Like, the stories that I've seen reporters, or the questions that I've been asked by reporters, it's very clear that they have influences or training and presence within that. And I think it goes back to, Sheila North, who was there, Wob was there, but that constant presence that you provide at CBC has just been a game changer. It's been, and the most important venue, although it's hard for me to say this as a Winnipeg Free Press employee, the most important media venue is the CBC in Winnipeg. It is the one that has the biggest reach, the biggest impact. So to have that there has just been crucial. So, like, just by being a human being, bringing all of those diverse experiences, that's how we change the game.
Again, everybody, oh, you guys are just blowing my mind. You're all so awesome, and everything that you say. I have another question I want to ask you as a group, and then after this question, I have a question for each of you individually. So we'll get to that next. But my first question for all of you, or my next question, is: how can public broadcasters, APTN, CBC, NCI, the Free Press, how can these big public broadcasters aid in the decolonization or reconciliation of the media on how people may judge or react to Indigenous content? Leonard, we'll go with you. If you guys ever need more time to think about it, we can move on to the next person or, whatever. But yeah, go ahead.
I was actually thinking about the other question that was supposed to come before this.
Oh, the one about the listeners and the viewers?
I mean, but it kind of relays into that. And
Okay.
so I'll say thank you to Nigan for the words that you were saying there. But in terms of the way that I see things sometimes is that public broadcasters, APTN, private corporations, there's a huge opportunity to bring more people in. And there's a diversity push. And one of the conversations that's happening on Twitter this week among journalism Twitter is how this CBC left the CBC because it's becoming too woke. And, it's kind of this thing where it's like, there's white journalists that are not happy with the way that things are going in terms of, newsrooms trying to diversify their journalists. And when I think about, places like CBC, there's opportunities to bring in journalists. And we think about, where Vera, I think, mentioned an Aboriginal journalism program that could have happened or that happened in the 80s, I think you said. And so even when I think about something like that, like I've never ever actually thought that journalism was something that I would be able to go into. As much as I loved it, I didn't think that, this is a place for me. And even when I started at the CBC, I was like, what's it going to be like over there? Maybe it's probably going to be racist. Like that was my assumption, when I started back in 2015, was that I'm going to be walking into a racist newsroom. And I think that there's opportunities for public broadcasters, APTN, to, if there's a way to train people, if there's a way to mentor people, if there's a way to bring people in on fellowships, and thinking about, how much has the public's perception changed over the last, 5, 6, 7 years. Nigan mentioned the Idle No More monkey as an example. Like that, I remember I was doing flooring when that particular day was happening, and I was watching for the news, and I knew that there was thousands and thousands of people across the country that were participating in actions, and all across the news landscape, it was all an IKEA monkey. Right, like they were put a monkey that was at IKEA on the front page and at the lead of their stories, when there was literally thousands and thousands of people occupying the streets and the malls and all of these other places across the country. And when I think about how much it's changed since then, a big part of that is I don't know more, and another big part of the change that has happened over the last 5 years has been the TRC report, and how much has the TRC calls to action provided change, and how much has our voices, because of social media, added to the discourse that we're seeing right now, right? And when I started at CBC Indigenous, there was 4 of us that were based in Winnipeg. We've grown into a 10-person team across the country, and when I started, there was a lot of people that were afraid to touch Indigenous stories. And the biggest reason is because people were afraid to get it wrong, because they don't know about who we are, right? And because it's changed so much, you've got people that are non-Indigenous that are reporting on residential schools, they're reporting on the 60 Scoop, they're reporting on child welfare system. And that has been the biggest change, is that there's an appetite for it. And I was talking to David Robertson, and I interviewed him about a book that was turned into a screenplay earlier or close to the end of last year. And I asked him, I was like, what do you think has changed? And he's like, well, people are interested in our stories, right? Like people wouldn't buy our books if they weren't interested in our stories, and people wouldn't buy our books if they were shit, right? Like they're good stories and people want to hear it, and there's an appetite for it. And that's how much things have changed, right? And so in a lot of ways, like we've shifted that, and that isn't the part of the newsroom saying, let's give them this. It was us saying, here's our stories, and us saying it on social media, and us saying it on Twitter and on Facebook. And you've got no choice but to grab onto it, because we're just going to keep on doing it anyways. And so you can be a part of it or you can miss it, right? And so I think that newsrooms definitely play a role in trying to shape some of that. And we've seen that through, you know, especially over the last year with the residential school graves that have been found.
Hey, Gretch Leonard. How can media aid in decolonization is the question, right?
How can these big public broadcasters aid in the decolonization of the media? And what we can actually kind of join the questions too, as Leonard had said, they kind of join together. And what are some of the ways listeners can help in that decolonization as well?
Well, it's all about learning. But with the media, I think one of the things I really take pride in at APTN is our stories are not only, as we say, murder and mayhem. A lot of times the stories that come out about our communities, about our people, aren't the positive stories. It's always the negative stories. But if you have a really feel good, positive story of what's happening out there, it's usually just on the ticker or it's kind of a flyby. Those positive stories are going to make changes in the listeners and viewers across this country. Many times, when I was a journalist prior to being a news director, I would come in with positive stories, what was happening in the city, things that were going on. My grandfather, bless his heart, he's passed on. But when I became a journalist, he said that, he said, I have a very big mouth and I would be a good talker. Like I like talking a lot. I like telling stories. So he said I was going to be perfect for it. But the sad thing is the newsrooms were not interested in the good stories. They were not interested in the positive happenings. You know, I remember when Children of the Earth School opened, I was ecstatic. I did the story on that school when it first opened, but it was all they looked at is the North End and what was going on in the air. It became a negative story. And I was so hurt by that I went to the news director. I'm like, why does it have to be about the negatives? Why does it have to be about the gangs? Why does it have to be about the shooting? Why does it have to be about the stabbings? Like that school is going to make a difference for our children to learn their identity. Why did we have to turn that story? Today, 30 years later, that story is changing. It has changed. And it's because, you know, there are many other journalists out there now, Indigenous and journalists that are at CBC, that are at Free Press, that are on this university radio programs and newspapers throughout the city, that it makes a difference. It has an impact. No story is too small. And that's what a lot of news directors will think. That, you know, every little positive story that you can get out there and share and expand is going to make a difference to the audience and to the viewers, because those are the ones we have to change the minds of. Those are the ones we have to change the tone that they hear of us, how they hear of us. There's still people out there that I'm shocked, you know, like I was in residential school and they go, you were? You're not that old. It wasn't that long ago. You know, the reaction of people today, non-Indigenous people and Indigenous people, sadly, is still, we are nowhere near where we should be at this point, 30 years later, which is really sad. And I look to you younger ones coming up behind me, that you have a major responsibility. And I think if you stay true to identity and culture and who you are, you'll make a huge difference. It's still a long ways to go though, but I am optimistic. Miigwech.
I really like what everybody's said so far. I have a different take on it. Not the ideals and what goes on behind the scenes, but I'll just share this story that this year, the Manitoba Country Music Awards happened, and myself and Don Amaro hosted. If you don't know who Don Amaro is, he's probably the biggest country star in the province. He's about to go national, international, you know, he's getting tons of invites, but he's an Indigenous guy. He and I hosted the Manitoba Country Music Awards. And if you know anything about country music, a lot of the songs are about the flag and freedom and these colors don't run and all this kind of stuff. So for Don Amaro and I to get up there, I was wearing my beadwork. I was wearing Every Child Matters bracelet. It was not an issue. And I don't feel like that would have been the case maybe 10, 15 years ago, maybe even a couple of years ago, that a place where it's notoriously conservative and notoriously Christian, to have two Indigenous people, me wearing my beadwork, no less, to host the show, the same show. I'm not just saying this, but I'm just showing you the progression that has been made. George Strait, the biggest country star of all time, maybe, hosted the Manitoba Country Music Awards in the 80s. And then as it went on, it was always like a country star, always a country star, always a country star. And then in the last few years, it's been a lot more grassroots. And I'm not sure if that's money or whatever, but the fact that Don and I got the chance to get up there, and Don wore his Winnipeg Jets jersey, and he turned around and it said 215 on the back, which was a huge deal, because he had just sang the national anthem at a Winnipeg Jets game, and they had gifted him that jersey that said, 215 on the back. And he wore that on stage. For us to be able to go up there and share that, even though it was just for, the country music world and, a couple thousand people that watched online, it was a huge deal just in that community alone. And I feel like the small progressions that we have in each community, whether it be sports, whether it be music, whether it be the arts, whether it be journalism, it's a huge deal, because guys like Lloyd Robertson are getting older. Guys like Peter Mansbridge are getting older, and they're leaving these spots for BIPOC people. Like Ian Hannah-Mansing has been there for a long time. He's a great journalist, and I love watching him. And I think he's earned the trust of people in this country to where they don't see him so much as a person of color, but as a trusted voice. And I think that's where we're trying to get to, is get away from, not necessarily like Lloyd Robertson himself, he's a great journalist, but if we're telling our own stories, we need to be telling them with trust, not trust from us, but trust from the listeners, that what we're telling them is not only accurate, but appropriate for them to know. Because I can't tell you how many times I've read a story in a newspaper or online or on Facebook that says there's a gathering going on and there's an article about it, and it says, if you want more info, please contact this person. And then to me, it's like, well, why didn't you just get this person to write the article and tell people about it? Because they'd be able to tell you everything about that you need to know, plus more, plus what's safe in a space like that, what's not safe in a space like that. I think we're getting to a point now where our voices are becoming more trusted. And obviously it's not going to happen overnight. And I'm sure everybody who's been in the media for more than, the last 5 years can tell you that it's an incredibly slow progression. But the fact is that, those spots are opening up, and people like Leonard and people like Nigan and people like Vera have stepped in and filled them, when maybe a number of years ago that wasn't possible. Not just not possible because they didn't want a not white face on the news, but they didn't want non-white ideas. There was nobody to white-splain things for people. And I'm not knocking, my grandpa's white, so it's not like I'm, anti-white or anything, but I understand the perspectives are different in the way that things are being explained, experienced, and maybe in the future a little bit more, what's the word I'm looking for, maybe a little bit more inclusive, not just for us as people, but for like all races. Because like I mentioned, my partner is African American. My daughter is going to be indigenous white, and my daughter is indigenous white and black, so she has like the strangest life experience, I'm sure, ahead of her to try and explain that to people. But for us to have these voices, it's maybe the most important thing we have going right now. So thanks.
I've lost track of what the question is, but I remember I wanted to tell this story. So when I started at the Free Press, I remember my very first piece, Paul Simin, the editor, said, write a piece about yourself, just explaining who you are to the readership. So my pieces are 800 words. And so I just basically said, I'm Nigan, this is who I am, this is where I come from, and here's what I do, and here's what I hope this column's about. And I got about a dozen like physical mail, like we're not talking emails, we're talking like actual letters, like people wrote letters, because the readership at the Free Press tends to be a little bit older. And And the number one message that I got was, man, are you ever self-obsessed or self-involved? I'm like, what? The number of hate mail that I got my first year at the Free Press is, I have a file folder, and it's this thick of the hate mail that I got from the Free Press. And the number one, my very favorite hate mail that I ever got was, it was a letter that was sent actually to the editor of the Free Press, but it was complaining about me, and he sent a copy to me. And he said, now that the Winnipeg Free Press has become an Indian newspaper, I'm going to cancel my subscription. And how dare you? You're such an Indian newspaper now. Okay, the Free Press hired one Indigenous person, one. Like, and let me tell you, they hadn't hired an Indigenous person since Colleen Simard, who was about 5 years previous to me. And then before that, there was basically one Indigenous person once in a while who would write for them. Like, if the Free Press becomes an Indian newspaper by one Indigenous person, imagine how their mind is blown now when we have frequent Indigenous peoples. We had Chantel Fiola just wrote a piece for us. We have Indigenous peoples every single week. Shelley Cook is now part of our newsroom as well. Like, I'm back to writing there again. And, you know, the also is, I can see Melissa's on this call. We've worked very hard to include Indigenous peoples in almost every single story on every single front page. You cannot get a front page of a newspaper, of a Free Press newspaper, without at least seeing something about Indigenous peoples on the front. And we're not talking about gang stories. We're talking about often very positive stories about things people are doing with the Mama Bear Clan or the Bear Clan or Initiative or in the Thunderbird House or whatever that, or the Friendship Center, whatever that might be. My point of saying that is that that one little moment turns the newsrooms into places where radical change begins to happen, just simply by the mere sake that we're present, right? And we become, what I said in my speech at the newspaper awards back in 2018 was, I said, I want every single newspaper in this country to become an Indian newspaper, by starting with hiring one, 2, 3, dozens. The goal of every newsroom should be to represent the community. That should be the goal of every newsroom. So in Manitoba, what does that mean? That means that 20% of us are Indigenous in Manitoba. And that means that 1 out of every 5 reporters, 1 out of every 5 editors, 1 out of every 5 major administrative leads at news agencies should be Indigenous. 1 out of every 5. That's the baseline. That's just the beginning. And we need APTN, we need NCI, we need all the other urban grassroots news. We need all of the different newspapers that we have that we run ourselves. We also need to have that presence. If a public entity, a public institution like CBC or Free Press or even Winnipeg Sun, by the way, I think it's interesting that Leonard said that he grew up reading the Winnipeg Sun. We did a study when we were in Urban Indian back in the day. We said, what do Native people read? And the number one thing, Winnipeg Sun, because it was free and there was always copies available, usually at the Robbins Donuts on Salter there. And so like that's interesting. That tells you a lot, I think, about what our people often read. So I think we can't forget about the Winnipeg Sun, even though the Winnipeg Sun is basically a shell of a newsroom. Almost nobody's there left anymore, but we can't forget that Indigenous peoples read the Winnipeg Sun. And so often for sports, often because they care about the sports stories. So I think by our mere presence and also the mere fact that we continue to plot at it nowadays, I think about where the Free Press is at. We were the only newspaper in the country to put Treaty 1 on the masthead, which, let me tell you, was a revolutionary act back in 2016. It blew people's minds. And now we're regularly publishing editorials about how premiers should resign over racist views. Like, I think that's remarkable change. And it's also indicative of what newsrooms actually look like. I put into the chat there. Everybody knows about this very conservative person who left the CBC and then published this thing about how the CBC is so woke. But isn't it interesting that the second we finally get a couple of BIPOC reporters and journalists, suddenly newsrooms are too woke? Isn't that coincidental? Oh, what a fluke! Eh? I'm sure there's nothing that combines there, or something that's coincidental there. So,
Miigwech for everyone on your insights. So we are running a little tight on time. I was hoping we have a couple questions in the chat, but I do have a question for each of you. I'm going to start with Vera. As an Anishinaabe Kwe, as an Indigenous woman, do you feel that there are different obstacles that we as Indigenous women face in the media as opposed to our male counterparts?
Definitely. It's still today. And it's first and foremost because we're mothers, we're caregivers. We have other responsibilities than our normal 9-to-5 job that tend to be a factor when you're out and about looking. And I've seen it and heard it. And that was one thing I took pride in when I was at APTN as news director, that family was your priority. And in mainstream media, when it comes to family, when we lose a relative, when we lose a loved one, we have responsibilities to tend to. And the industry doesn't see it, doesn't understand that. You know, my own experience, I lost my grandfather and he was my rock. I'm an only child. I was raised by my grandparents. My grandfather passed away and I was told that if I was not at work, not to bother coming back, because I had to leave for 4 days. I had to go take care of things. I had a funeral to plan. And it devastated me. So I went and did what I did, but I went back and I quit the job because of that. That still happens today. Why? And it's because people don't understand who we are as individuals, as Indigenous people, with our responsibilities. And that's a fight that I think we're going to have to really keep pursuing, because women, we have huge responsibilities, but we also still have to come to work. We have to, tell our stories, share our stories, and make sure that we look after everybody else as well. It's a really hard one to try and have people understand. And it's not just, non-Indigenous people, but sometimes even our own people. It's not there's no easy solution to this. But like I said earlier, we need to be humble, we need to be patient, we need to be kind to one another, and that's everybody right across the board, respectfully. I don't know if that answers, or if that's
great. No, that was great. Great answer. My next question is both for Leonard as well as for Stefan. You guys have both touched base on your past earlier on in the webinar, whether that be addiction or more of a criminal past. I myself have struggled and dealt with addiction since the age of 18, and it's always been problematic for me, and working in the media kind of fueled that fire back in the early days. But my question to the both of you, whoever wants to answer first, do you find it hard to leave behind that past in this field? And do you think that having that experience in your past is an advantage in some way to advocate for others with those similar pasts?
Okay. As far as like addiction goes, I was very open with my past. I was open with the experiences that I had, the very dark experiences that I've had. And in fact, like I mentioned, I was doing speaking. There was a documentary done on it. I gave myself the power to take that back. I didn't give anybody any ammo to come back at me in 10 years when, if things grew or if things went away. And then people could point to that and say, that's the reason why he didn't make it, is because I'll use the words that were used on me. He's a junkie. He needs to just get over it and go die somewhere, which are words that were said to me. But I reclaimed it in a sense to the fact that nobody can use it against me anymore. That's my story, and I've shared my story willingly. I don't think it will inhibit me or turn against me unless somebody really would try to, and I don't know why they would try to, but I don't feel like it would inhibit me beyond anything right now. No.
For me personally, like I grew up in I grew up in the 90s, at a time when like gangs were taking off. I grew up in poverty. And so, even throughout my 20s, like I experienced a lot of shit. I went through a lot of things that a lot of our people go through, right? And we've got a big family. So our family has experienced a lot of the things that we read about in the newspapers, right? And so pretty much everything that you can think of when it comes to living in the North End, like I've experienced it and we've experienced it. And it gives you a different experience when you're able to go into a newsroom you know, where a lot of the people have very middle class life experiences, right? And you can say to people like, how does the gas going up to 130 affect people, right? Like that's a class issue that you don't see if you're too comfortable, right? And I was talking to my son yesterday. I was like, you know, you got to figure out what you want to do in your life. I said, I've tried flooring, I've tried welding, I've tried, you know, selling drugs, I've tried, you know, I've done all so many different types of jobs that I've been able to experience different parts of this city. I've been able to experience different classes of this city, been able to experience different rooms and gone into different places that, you know, if you've been on one track the whole time, that's all you know, right? Versus like, I've tried so many different things, and that kind of adds to my experience where I know a lot of people from a lot of different parts of this city, right? And for me, you know, in terms of walking away from the past, like I got charged in 2009, and it was a difficult thing to walk away from at the time. And so for me, that was something that I had to leave in the past in order to be able to get to where I'm at. But it's not something where it's like, okay, like I'm going to deny everything that has ever happened to me in my life, because, you know, without that, like without all of those experiences, I wouldn't be who I am and I wouldn't know what I know, right? And so that's helped me. And I say to people, like, you know, if you've been through some shit like that's going to help you in the long run. It's going to help with your experiences. And so I don't know, I've never really looked at it as a negative thing. I think like I probably would be in a lot different situation if I had not gotten into trouble, but I'm okay with where I'm at.
Thank you so much, both of you, for those answers. And then for Nigan, as an academic, do you think it is beneficial to teach students ways on how to decolonize the media? It came to my attention not like a couple days ago. I've noticed some universities are actually teaching a class on decolonizing the media. What are your thoughts on possibly having something like that for your students?
Yeah, I mean, I think just basic, we should just teach critical thinking generally. And so I think it's important people will often complain to say, oh, everybody has an opinion now, that they'll complain about millennials a lot. They'll say, oh, millennials are always taking selfies and putting their opinions out there. Like, do we all realize that's what we want people to do? Like we want people to have opinions and thought and be able to critique political leaders and have thoughts on Spider-Man and to think about all the different things that are going on with representation. Like, we want people to do that. So, I mean, I just think the hallmark of any critical program should be critical thinking. And so I happen to be in Indigenous studies or Native studies. So, I mean, our whole job is to get people thinking about how policy, how the words of the Prime Minister, or, you know, a newspaper, those things, what they do to represent, how do they impact, how can we change those things? Like, that's our job in Indigenous studies, to do that. And then more importantly, I think it should be, everybody should be doing that, right? It should also be in history, it should be in English, it should be in psychology and sciences and biology, all these different things. And, you know, it should be in agriculture. Like, we should be thinking about, like, there's this ad that's out there right now, and it's made in a good intention. Most things tend to be that way. And it's about talking about farmers in Manitoba. And it's this guy from East Selkirk, and he's saying, my family has farmed this land for 5 generations, and this is how proud we are of Manitoba, and et cetera, et cetera. And then the ad ends and they say, isn't this great, Manitoba? Really salt of the earth farmer. And all I'm thinking to myself is, that's my land. He stole my land. That farmer stole my land in East Selkirk. That East Selkirk is my reserve. And we were kicked off the land in 1907. And I didn't get a chance to grow up on my land because of that. He's not a bad person, but the fact that he's so flagrantly ignorant, and we're celebrating that story, and we're doing it completely without context, to say, it should start out by going, yeah, we've been here for 5 generations because we were given the land that was stolen from Indians. It'd be a much different ad now, but it wouldn't have quite the romantic impact. But like, that's the kind of job that I think we should be doing in universities. And we should be doing it everywhere. You know, when I was a high school teacher, I had students watch TV for a week and then track what they saw. And I got them to watch movies for product placement, only product placement. I said, okay, guys, we're going to watch this movie. I want you to count how many times you see Coca-Cola. And then, you know, that kind of thing. Our job is to be able to create sort of a critical consciousness. And yes, I sometimes complain about millennials, but I actually think that this generation and my daughter's generation we are in good hands. They are critical, they are brilliant, and most importantly is they're changing the game. And just because those in my age and above can't handle the change doesn't mean that the change isn't good.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. So we're almost out of time. We got about 6 minutes here left. I don't want to keep anybody too much longer because I know lunchtime's almost over. Everyone might be hungry, but we do have just a couple questions. I think there's like 2 in the chat, but I'm going to kind of just direct them to someone specifically. And I think this one would be good for Leonard. Joseph says, in attempting to decolonize the media, how much control do you have as a mainstream journalist in the narrative? He was a former CBC journalist in the early 90s, arguing many times with producers over clips and sound bites. I chose to tell the story that was very important to the voices that were being shared with me. So Leonard, what are your thoughts on that question?
I think there's 2 different things to that one. For me, I'm on like this experience thing, right? Like where I'm trying to gain as much experience as I'm trying to get as fast as I can as possible. And so I feel like I'm finally getting to that point. But in our particular unit, like we do have a lot of editorial independence where, you know, if you come to the story meeting with a bunch of pitches, if your pitch is good, then we'll roll with it, right? And there was an example that happened last month with one of my relatives, actually, who's working for CBC Kids, and they posed the question for CBC Kids: should Indigenous peoples get their land back? And they posted it as a question, which is like a really stupid question, a way of framing this discussion. And they got Tom Flanagan to be the balance person for that, right? And they literally got the worst person to do that. And so with the kinds of stuff that I'm doing, I do feel like I do have a responsibility to the community. I have a responsibility to share a lot of the positive stories, to uplift our successes, to uplift our voices. And so for me, I have a lot of freedom to be able to say, you know what, I'm going to call this person, I'm going to call this person, I'm going to call this person, and try to balance it out as much as possible. But I also I frame the questions, I frame, you know, what quotes am I going to use? I'm going to decide this. And so there's a lot of editorial independence where it's not like we have an editor above us saying, you got to cut this, and this. And that, in my opinion, is changing mainstream media, because, you know, we're writing Anishinaabe from Lake Manitoba. We've got Mohawk reporter, we've got Mi'kmaq reporter, and other non-Indigenous reporters are following our lead on that. And so it's breaking away from we need to compare and contrast these 2 things with an Indigenous person with the worst possible person that you can think of, right? And so with that, it's like, okay, like we can uplift our stories, but we can do it in a way that has a bit of a different take on it. So just to kind of go on to decolonize the media part, we started Red Rising magazine in 2015, and that magazine was started specifically for, you know, creating our own narratives and controlling our own narratives. And it's through independent media where decolonization is where it can take place. Right now, working at a place like CBC or Free Press or wherever, you're trying to hit that professional standard. Whereas if you've got an independent podcast, or if you've got an independent magazine, you do and say whatever the hell you want, right? And that's kind of where a decolonization aspect will really take place.
You gosh, Leonard. Yeah, I was going through the chat and there was only just one question. Anyway, but I'll ask, you already answered my last and final question before I let you guys all go. Is it possible to decolonize the media? And Leonard, you already touched base on that, so thank you. So let's jump right into to Vera, and then we'll go through the order again one last time before we say aho.
Thank you. I think it's been a long, I've been in the industry 30 years. I see this much change. It's going to take a long time, but I'm optimistic it'll happen. Like I said, there's a lot of you coming up behind us, senior people that will make that change. And I think over time, slowly but surely, we will make a dent in it. Will it be in the lifetime of my grandchildren? I pray so. I hold you responsible for that, but I'll do the best I can to lead the way still. But I do believe it will happen in some point in time. Miigwech.
Is it possible to decolonize the media? I think so. When I started a podcast, I actually called the podcast Ever Sick because I wanted people to like think about what that meant. Like some people don't know what that term means. For us, it's kind of like an exclamation. It can be used in a million different ways. So I wanted to kind of break down that wall and open people up to the idea that, you know, one thing that binds us as Indigenous people, I'm sure everybody can agree, is humor. Like everybody's got a crazy uncle, maybe your grandpa, maybe your dad, maybe your mom is nuts and hilarious. So one of those things that I really tried to do was to break that wall down, bring in humor, because I'm of the strong opinion, especially when it comes to our stories, that you catch more flies with honey than you do with vinegar. And I feel like decolonizing the media is simply just getting people to let their guard down, in a sense. So once that guard comes down, open-mindedness and willingness will follow. And then, you know, we take further steps, like Leonard said, like Nigan said, like Vera said, it's slow, but it's coming. And it has to take on sort of a life of its own. We have to get the ball rolling, but once the ball is rolling, we can kind of let other people in on it, because once other people are in on it and there's open-mindedness and willingness, then we all work together, and then, you know, we're able to tell our own stories.
So, I mean, is decolonizing, I think it's already happened or happening and will happen. So, like, I mean, all media is not a monolith, so it happens at different places and different times. It's like reconciliation. Like people would say reconciliation's dead. I'm like, that's a silly thing to say, because reconciliation, I see it every day. I see it in little moments. It doesn't last. That's the problem, is that it's often in little moments where in Idle No More, we danced, we took over a mall and danced, did a round dance for 15 minutes. That's reconciliation. Like, you know, Indigenous peoples creating love and generosity and kindness and reoccupying public space and convincing people that you don't have to be just buying things all the time. You know, that's reconciliation of what that looks like, but it's only 15 minutes. So, you know, what does that look like when we do it for an hour, a day, a lifetime? That's what I think we're talking about when we're talking about decolonization. Does it sustain itself? Like, my question that I've often asked myself is, what will happen with the free press? I just took a 3-month leave. And I wondered to myself, what would happen with the newspaper? Like, if I'm not around. Turns out, does some pretty good stuff, and in fact, some better stuff. And so that said to me that I had some impact. It also said to me that there are some good people who can also handle this work. And it also says that the free press has been here for 150 plus years and will continue to be here, and it'll grow and change with the community because it's got good people around it. It's got good people who are committed to the growth of that newspaper. You know, we should all, and this is my, you know, personal plug, we should all support the free press and other independent newspaper. The free press is one of the only independent newspapers left in the country. And so the whole idea that, you know, we complain a little bit about a firewall here, or we complain a little bit about paying for news in whatever way that we're doing, you know, that's the lifeblood of newspapers and of media agencies. And so decolonizing it means that we have to put our money where our mouth is. And it is social media that I think is the greatest impact of media in this generation, but it's also the ability for us to support independence when newspapers, when media agencies, when small startups like websites or podcasts or, you know, even, it is crazy to start a newspaper, but Trevor Graz has been trying his butt off to get First Nations voice off the ground for years now. We should all be supporting him, and trying our best to try to give ads. In my department, I have a small pot of money I always dedicate it to support First Nations voice, because I want to support our media agencies, and that we can have this against tremendous obstacles. First Nations voices can find ways in mainstream outlets like newspapers, but also, we don't always have to turn to that. That's why I'm glad to see Stefan and Leonard, who really are the generation that are much more competent on these podcasting and vlogs. And although somebody said something about TikTok, I don't know. I'm still having trouble figuring that one out, but there you go. So, that we should be in those venues, and it's critical to have those our people in those venues. So every single one of you on this call, by you entering into those venues, sharing your voices and your ideas, you are changing the game. You are decolonizing the media. This is not something that just we are doing. You are also doing it every single day. I see my students, who are the most savvy people I know, doing it every single day, just by doing it on their Facebook, doing it on their Twitter, or all the other platforms. So, okay, well, thanks so much, and miigwech, everybody.
Oh, thank you so much. Kitchi miigwech to all of our speakers. Before we go, I kind of just want to send a little shout out and a big thank you to Amanda Fredland, who's on this call. A little over a month ago, she made a post on Facebook saying, why is there no webinars? Why can't I find anything about decolonizing the media? And I saw her post and I was like, light bulb, why isn't there anything on this? So I kind of jumped on her idea and rolled with it. So Amanda, I know you're there. I can see you. So big thanks for helping get this idea for this webinar out. And thank you again so much to Leonard, Vera, Steph, and Nigon. You guys are such inspirations and role models in the field. And I thank you so much. And to everybody for joining us today. So enjoy the rest of your day. You guys did amazing. It has been recorded. So if anybody would like to watch it again or have someone else watch it, you can just send me a message or what have you. I put my email in the chat as well. So thank you again. Oh, enjoy the rest of your day. I'm very happy.
Thanks, everyone.
Miigwech. Bye.
Miigwech, everybody. Take care.
Take care. Bye.
Bye, everyone.
Is it done? You exit out?